Hello, everyone, and welcome to another view live from Fort Monroe. I'm Barbara Hamm Lee. It's the 404th anniversary of the landing of the first Africans in English North America. Those 20 and so enslaved Africans landed in 1619 aboard the ship the White Lion at Port Comfort, today known as Fort Monroe, located right here in Hampton, Virginia. During the next hour, we will ensure future generations remember 1619 and the place of this event in our national narrative. We're in front of a live audience at the Fort Monroe Visitor and Education Center. Stay tuned. Another view or history lesson will be right back after this news from NPR and WHRO News.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View, live from the Fort Monroe Visitor and Education Center. I'm Barbara Hamm Lee. 404 years ago, history was made when 20 or so enslaved Africans landed here at Fort Monroe, becoming the first Africans in English North America. We have a stellar panel to discuss the history, the preservation, and the future of the story of 1619. Please welcome to Another View, Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander. She is the endowed professor of Virginia Black History and Culture at Norfolk State University. She is the author of numerous articles and books, including Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad and An African American History of the Civil War of Hampton Roads. Dr. Newby Alexander has appeared on numerous national programs and documentaries, including PBS's Many Rivers to Cross. And she's one of our favorite guests here on Another View. Please welcome Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander.
Thank you so much, Barbara.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Brian Owens is a second-generation professional sculptor and painter. He's best known for monumental bronze sculpture in public places and museum-quality oil portraiture. After a nationwide search and vigorous process, Brian was introduced at the 400-year commemoration of the landing of the first enslaved Africans as the selected artist to design and sculpt the memorial to mark the 1619 historical event. Brian says, "Art is not something I do, it is who I am. I didn't choose to be an artist, it chose me." Please welcome Brian Owens. Hi, Brian.
Hello.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Barbara. It's an honor to be here.
Great. And Calvin Pearson, a Hampton native and the founder and president of Project 1619 Incorporated, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to promote the landing of the first enslaved Africans in English North America. Calvin has led a grassroots effort since 1994 to tell the true story of 1619. He is also chairman of the National Juneteenth Grassroots Enslavement Legacy Commission. He has authored many magazine articles and papers on the subject and has been the driving force to get this story told. He's here to share with us today. Please welcome Calvin Pearson. Hey, Calvin.
Thank you.
How are you?
Doing good.
Good. So, Calvin, I'm going to start with you because, there's been a lot of controversy around 1619 and being woke and, all kinds of stuff that has nothing to do with the actual event. So take us back and tell us exactly what happened in August of 1619.
Well, if we go back 404 years, we found out, not by Jamestown, but we found out that a pirate ship, which was an English ship, landed along these shores in August of 1619. And on that ship were what we call the 20 and odd, the first enslaved Africans brought to English North America. 3 or 4 days later, the Treasure arrived, which was another English pirate ship. Between those two ships, we now know that there were 32 Africans brought ashore here at Point Comfort, and they were eventually sold for food. But those 32 Africans were eventually transported to plantations up and down the James River. One of the key stories we've tried to tell is that of those 32 Africans, only one went to Jamestown, only one went to Kingsmill, but for the past 300, 400 years, Jamestown has dominated the story of the first landing and trying to convince people that all of the Africans went to Jamestown. So we're trying to correct the narrative because history is based on facts. It's not based on folklore. It's not based on tourism. And that's what we've been facing for a number of years.
And you've been doing this work since 1994.
1994, I approached Jamestown and I said, your narrative is incorrect. And they said, no, your narrative is incorrect, which made me go out and want to prove it. Because the documentation, Jamestown had documentation since 1620. When John Rolfe wrote in his journal that during the latter part of August, a ship arrived at Point Comfort with 20 and odd Negroes. Mm-hmm. It's been there since 1620, but Jamestown took that passage and took out Point Comfort and put in Jamestown. And that's where the false narrative has been for until we changed it.
So, Cassandra, when we talk about this history, a lot of times people say, well, okay, that's where it started. But these 20 or so, 20 and odd Africans had a life. They were real people. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like, what they brought to America? You know, what were the skills? What were the things that made them whole people, not the chattel that ultimately people began to think of them as?
Well, you know, one of the things that you have to do when you talk about enslavement is you have to take the human being off the table and make them things, make them like animals, property, without past, without a present, without a future. They're just there to serve me. And so many of these Africans who were forcefully brought here had an entire culture. Some of them had actually been converted to Christianity, and not just by the Portuguese, but in their homeland. Many of them came from the kingdom of Ndongo. Some would eventually come from the Congo and from the Cameroons, that whole West Central African area. And they brought skills. They brought agricultural skills with them because these were fully grown people who were living free in a society, in a kingdom that was very advanced, very prosperous. And so many of the things that we forget is that once the tobacco industry, for example, started in Virginia, that many of these Africans had already been producing tobacco in West Central Africa for, generations prior to that. And they produced a type of pipe that was very popular among the Europeans when they started utilizing their skills in producing this. And it became one of the economic driving forces. Now, for a lot of people today, they're like, what? Pipe? Most people, they would either chew tobacco or they would put it in a pipe and smoke it. You didn't have cigarettes at that particular time. And so that was a little bit part of the economy. But the other thing is the maritime industry. In West Central Africa, a lot of and also in West Africa, a lot of the landscape was similar to the landscape here. A lot of rivers, a lot of their estuaries had been overrun. So you had the rivers flowing basically into the ocean, and they knew how to navigate fast-moving rivers. They understood that pattern. That was not something that the English knew. If you've ever been to England, you've maybe punted along the Thames or the Cam River, you know that their rivers are rather narrow. And it's not like the rivers here. You cannot throw a coin across our rivers around here because you're talking about in some cases a mile or more. And so the rivers were fast moving. They understood navigation. They came with those skills. They understood how to build ships. And so I guess Americans in general have created this false narrative that somehow civilization did not begin until white people walked on this continent. And that's why history often will not begin until their arrival, as if nothing was there before. Never mind that the English took over native towns and communities and then renamed them and claimed they built it. So all of that false narrative is a part of why Africans from West Central Africa in particular were often not named, or if their names were recorded, they were lost. Documents were not kept. And that's also why the skills that they brought with them, the knowledge, the intellectual knowledge, the culture that they brought with them has been absorbed. And so, I liken it to what we do with Southern cuisine. We have this annoying habit of calling the foods that we eat in the South Southern cuisine. And we only have white chefs producing the Southern cuisine. But then when we talk about Black people, it's African American cuisine. And I want to ask the question, what is the difference?
Mac and cheese is mac and cheese.
Exactly. And it was created.
But maybe not.
But it was created by African Americans. What we have is a very blended society in the South. But we have taken away people's contributions and their culture and appropriated it and refashioned it to be like what Calvin was talking about with what Jamestown did to this whole narrative, refashioned it into a mythological status instead of sticking with truth-telling.
So, Calvin, and Brian, I have not forgotten about you. I'm going to bring you into the conversation just a little bit. But, Calvin, I want to ask you then, when you travel all over the country talking about this, what is the reaction or what are people saying outside of Virginia in terms of this story, in terms of this narrative? Do they understand what this means and why it's important?
Most people don't. This is a lot of people call this the Virginia story. I've talked to people in California. They say, well, yeah, we heard about it, but that's your story. So when I travel around the country, I mean, there's a lot of discourse that people don't believe you. They don't believe slavery existed. We get all types of responses when we travel around the country. So that's why it's always an ongoing educational process to teach the people around the world. I mean, I talk to people in Africa, in Paris. People around the world want to know what's going on with Virginia. How did the settlement of Jamestown get started? There's so much information out there that we try to share that people just don't know. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's this ongoing process. I ran across a quote not too long ago. Don't know who gave it or who wrote it, but it says that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Those that do not want history taught intend for it to be repeated.
And we'll get more into that because as we talk about the education and what's happening in our country going from there. But I want to bring up one other point, and then I'm going to talk to Brian about the commemoration of all of this and how it's going to come along. But Cassandra, there was also there were two people from that ship. Angelo, what was his name? Angelo. Well, Angelo went to Jamestown, but the two that stayed here in Hampton, Anthony and Isabella, and they had a son.
Yes, they had a son that they named after their owner, William Tucker, and he was recorded in the church records as being the godson of Captain William Tucker. Which means, we don't have the same attitude about godchildren, godson, goddaughter, the way that they did. That had a legal association with it. If you were a godparent, your status, you were covering that individual. So your status was passed on to that particular child. And so often you were the protector of that particular person. And so what that clearly meant was that this child was not in bondage. And I do differ from a number of historians and other scholars talking about enslaved people coming versus those in bondage, because I just have not seen the evidence that these first Africans were actually enslaved here in this country. They were captured by the Portuguese and taken to be enslaved. But in this country, there were no laws. There were practices of holding people in bondage. And by the way, the majority of white people who came to Virginia were also in bondage. There's the myth that all these people were free. And, I call it the Gone with the Wind myth. Everybody thinks, if I was back there, I'd be sitting on the veranda sipping mint juleps. No, you wouldn't. You would be in the field somewhere. But, this notion that somehow all the Africans were enslaved and it began immediately, I don't see any evidence to support that. I see evidence to the contrary, that we had a majority, and I'm by majority up to 90% of the population who were here in Virginia were in bondage. And the English started causing the native peoples to be in bondage as well. And then they passed a law forcing them to be apprenticed, and I put air quotes around that, which actually meant that they were taking Indian children and enslaving them. And they were selling them once slavery began as mulatto slaves. And so you had a very interesting society that happened this way because there were no clear laws. The courts were making decisions based in part on English law, but also on what was economically convenient for that society.
The difference between being in bondage versus being enslaved meant that if you were in bondage, you could get out?
Yes, if you were in bondage, and by the way, it wasn't you were either a servant or indentured servant either. That's part of the mythology. An indentured servant meant that you had a contract. And the majority of Europeans who came to this country did not have a contract. English law said that, and European law in general said, if you were a Christian, you could not be held more than 20 years. That was seen as a lifetime servitude. What happened with the Africans was that you would start to see practices being done in which people were being held longer than 20 years if they happened to live that long. And so the bondage thing was really about whether you had a contract or didn't have a contract, and those who didn't have contracts, it was kind of the whim of the individual who was holding you, whether they would actually release you. And we would see some court cases of whites and blacks challenging that in court, saying that I'm a Christian, you can't hold me past a certain point of time. And these were what they call freedom suits.
Okay. Brian, let me bring you into the conversation because in 2019, when the 400th anniversary of or commemoration of 1619 happened, you were named as the sculptor to create a living monument to this event. Talk to me about the process. How did you, after you received the nod, what were your first thoughts in terms of how am I going to do this? This is a lot of history to put into a monument.
Well, I probably sat down and shed a tear because now there's a big difference between competing for a thing and being called upon to produce results within 30 days. So there's that. At that point in time, I had no ideas really. So you set yourself in motion and you try to create a situation where you maximize your best chances of success, knowing that a lot of this is based on chance and the whims of others, and then you roll with it as best you can, and then you lean into the work and you don't wait for inspiration. For example, you treat it like a job. In the words of Leonard Cohen, you show up and go to work every day, knowing that today it may not come, and that you are not in control of this enterprise. But if you do that and you're consistent with it, it's likely you're going to think of something. So I thought of something. And then you have to, as the process unfolds, you have to check yourself and say, okay, well, is this, can this really be constructed? Do I have time to think this through? Is it too big? Or conversely, is it too small? Is it too weak? Does it lack gravity? And then the clock is ticking, of course, and you have to settle at some point on some approach, and having run out of time, and then you run with it. And in my case, I came up with something that was satisfying to me. You don't even have time to show it to people. Maybe you show it to your best friend. Because in this particular instance, we had 30 days. And then you start cranking out drawings. So you're in the coffee shop drinking a latte, whipping out one drawing after another, and they all look terrible. And then you're back in the wee hours of the morning when everyone else is asleep, photoshopping all the crud and the images taped on top of other images until you have something that you can present. And you do your best, and the do your best part is like that's heavy material, because all of your experiences to that date come into play. Every substantial conversation you've had, every demonstration, every presentation, everything gets directed and energized and focused in on that presentation.
So you had an opportunity to go around and talk to people, if I'm not mistaken, listening tours?
Yeah, but that happened after I won the commission.
Right, that's what I'm saying. And so after you won the commission, how did that help you in terms of designing the statue that is being created now?
Well, that's interesting, because when we set off to do the listening tour, we weren't sure. We were just winging it. We had an exotic plan and lots of important people to talk to. But we were like, it was part fact gathering and part making sure that we were on the right track, and part wanting to do the right thing and not be arrogant. And then like once you set yourself down that road, then like I said before, you've put yourself in a position to get lucky. And then we got lucky. So people started to start like offering up their ideas, and a couple of them stuck. So you go into this thing not knowing how it's all going to play out, but it was worth it. So I got a couple of additional design ideas. I had come up with a preliminary design, a concept design, but then we just went back and reworked it.
So what did people tell you they wanted? What did
they're not that bold.
They're not that bold?
No.
I mean, in terms of when they come see it, whatever it is, did they talk about what was important to them in terms of what you depict?
No, because we didn't actually show them anything during the listening tour. What
were you asking them? I'm trying to get a sense of what those conversations were about.
I can't even recall if we showed them. Maybe we showed them some preliminary drawing. I can't even recall now because it's been so long. But the whole idea was not to tell them what we were doing. The whole idea was to get them to run their mouth and feel like they could say anything.
Okay.
And
so what did they say?
We must have shown them something, now that I think of it. But anyway, people seem to be to fall into roughly two groups. One group of people said, "Just tell the truth. We don't care how we don't particularly look forward to seeing images of black people getting messed over, but if that's what it takes to tell the story, do what you got to do. Just tell the truth." And then there were another group of people saying, "Yeah, we know there's a story to be told, but we want to leave the premises feeling hopeful. Don't take that away." So there's this. We're trying to serve both interests.
No pressure.
Well, no, not really, because I had a sense that we would work it out. Because by the time the listening tour was over, I was already thinking of ideas. Mm-hmm. Because by the time the listening tour took place, we were 6 months into the project. We didn't have a whole lot to show for it. Mm-hmm. But you wake up every morning thinking about it. So it's not like your brain hasn't been every night when you go to sleep. Your brain is just it's whirling. It's like this huge flywheel spinning off ideas. And so you never have a lack of ideas. You're set to the task of deciding which idea to run with.
If you're just joining us, we're coming to you live from the Fort Monroe Visitor and Education Center as we commemorate the landing of the first enslaved Africans to English North America in 1619, 404 years ago. Our guests include historian Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander, sculptor and artist Brian Owens, and Calvin Pearson, founder and president of Project 1619 Incorporated. Calvin.
Can I just go back and piggyback on something our esteemed Newby Alexander said? There was a lot of discussion about whether they were enslaved, held in bondage. So different terminology. I hate to call them slaves because when you look at slave, it means really that you're going to be held in bondage for life. And when we look at those first Africans who were brought here, we look at Isabella and Antony were freed after about 15 years. Most of them were freed by 1650. So it's hard to call them slaves if their masters or plantation owners freed them after a certain number of years. So when we talk about unfree, we talk about bonded, held in bondage. I think that's the correct vernacular for us to be using because they were enslaved in Africa. Their status changed as soon as they got off that ship here at Point Comfort. Some people said they were treated as indentured servants. But when we look at the relationship between Captain William Tucker and Isabella and Antony, we hate to say that they liked their master. But there was a special bondage there. Isabella was a midwife to Captain William Tucker's children. So Captain William Tucker valued the fact that he had the first African family in his household. He valued it so much that he was willing to baptize baby William, which was unheard of at that time. White people didn't baptize African children during that time frame. So there was a special bond that they had with each other. There was an affinity between both of them, which was not consistent with the history that we tell today. There's always a division between those enslaved and those who enslaved them. And that's really when you start getting into antebellum slavery. But for those of you here, the history of Virginia is so unique. Nobody can tell that story but us because between 1619 and 1661, we did a whole lot of things here in Virginia that was against the law, probably. So for those of you who've never been here before, we're glad you're here today because this is ground zero. Mm-hmm. This is where it all began. I tell people we need to call August Black History Month.
In Virginia?
Well,
period.
Worldwide. Yeah. Because why do we call February Black History Month the coldest and shortest month of the year? It all began here. First enslaved Africans, if we want to call them that, the birth of the first African child, the birth of the first African marriage. I mean, we've got so many firsts here in Virginia. We're Black History Month.
So let me ask you all this. So the 250th commemoration of the signing of the Declaration of Independence is coming in 2026. Where does this story fit into that narrative, if it does at all, Cassandra?
You would start with me, right?
Of course.
I guess I'm going to sort of continue my whole point about how the majority of people who first came here from either Europe or from Africa were not free. Native peoples, of course, had their own societies and cultures and different divisions. But the concept of that the Declaration represents of freedom has always been an ongoing concept. And I remind people that the people who wrote the Declaration were not talking about the majority of people in this country. They were talking about their class, the people they knew, the people they respected. From that point moving forward, we have defined and redefined who can be free in this country and what does freedom look like for different groups of people, whether you are male or female, whether you are an adult or a child, whether you are black, white, Asian, whatever. The concepts of freedom have constantly been defined and redefined, whether you're wealthy or poor, because we tend to criminalize poverty in this country, especially in the latter half of the 20th century moving forward. So what does freedom look like if you're an elderly person? What kind of freedoms do you have? And so the Declaration of Independence represents, in my mind, the first time that a nation talked about freedom being a right for everyone. And of course, many nations practiced that before, but this is the first time we would see that made as a declaration that this nation would be about that. But it has taken us centuries, and we're still hopefully moving in that direction. Although, we do say that one step forward, two step backward kind of thing, because people are basically selfish, evil little buggers. And so they don't want a lot of people to have what they want to have, but often do not actually have. And so this story is a story about freedom. But it didn't work out the way that perhaps we would like, a Hollywood movie to work out. But it shows you, if you actually know this story, you know that the people who were forcefully brought here did not simply capitulate to their position here in this society, that their quest for freedom was ongoing, continual, and it is something that I love the kind of arc of this location, because this location seemingly was a place where, yes, people were put in bondage, but they fought that bondage to be free. So during the American Revolution, we would see some Africans and African Americans gathering here to get aboard British ships to be free. We would see the same thing happen during the War of 1812. We would see the same thing happen during the Civil War. We would see this ongoing effort. I can't even talk without moving my hands. But we would see this ongoing effort by people of African descent, Native peoples, to be free right here on this site and in other sites, especially in Hampton Roads, because Hampton Roads is really where America began. Yes, I know Florida keeps talking about the Africans who were brought there in the 16th century, and I'm not denying that. But Florida didn't become a part of the United States until the 19th century. So can we really start going back in time and talk? And of course, Massachusetts thinks that the nation started at Plymouth Rock in 1620.
That's what we were taught in high school.
So, we have a lot of corrections to make, but I think because Virginians don't know this history yet, we cannot be a purveyor and an advocate for our own history. We let other people try to tell us the truth, and they don't really know it. And I applaud Calvin, because I've been in meetings with Calvin, and he's not just a dog with a bone. But he can be a vicious dog with a bone. But that's what you need to help tell a story that people don't want to hear.
Don't want to tell. Calvin, you wanted to add something?
Well, I can't speak for everyone, but I don't think the majority of brown and black people in this country revere 1776. The Emancipation Proclamation was not about us, still has not been achieved. When Frederick Douglass said, "What is the 4th of July to the black man?" he was correct, because brown and black people were held in bondage for another 89 years after 1776. 1776 didn't free not one person, did not free one person of color, but yet we celebrate it as Independence Day. We want to have a cookout and celebrate independence. So that's why August is Black History Month.
But Brian, and then I'm getting ready to come to questions from the audience. But Brian, I want to ask you, because your sculpture will be revealed in 2026. Is that correct?
I'm
Or
not sure what
before
the
then?
time. I'm not sure
Okay.
what the timeline is.
Okay, not sure yet. Okay, all right. Questions from the audience? Do we have any questions? Lisa, there was some folks over on this side. If you're just joining us, we're talking about the commemoration, 404th commemoration of the 1619, the landing of the first enslaved Africans to Point Comfort, which is Fort Monroe. Yes.
Hi, my name is Dawn Jenkins, and I'm here just listening. I'm from New York City originally, but I did a DNA, the ancestry, and a lot of it said I was from Virginia, North Carolina, and so the sense of patriotism that you were just talking about, like when we talk about the 4th of July, I never really particularly paid attention to it. It just was another holiday. But when we talk about how we've been here in this country for so long, I should have a sense of belonging, but I'm always told you're African American. You're not American, you're not a part of the founding. A lot of things we're just struggling to learn about in school, they're trying to deny. So I'm trying to teach my own child, who's mixed race, about how he should feel a sense of pride for the country he comes from, but also know where you would come from if we weren't here. And I don't even know that. I know that they say, like, you're from West Africa, but said Cameroon, Congo, Mali, like so many places. It was like 12 different regions. And then they had European, Wales, all these things. And I'm like, I don't know anything. I would have never known these things had I not had access and money to get it done.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that comment. Cassandra, you want to respond?
Well, the reason I think that Ancestry usually says Virginia, North Carolina is there was very little difference between Virginia and especially Eastern North Carolina for I don't know how long. The people who settled in those areas, the people who were already there in those areas, they intermingled quite a bit. And so what we see American society do, except for those black people who ended up passing for white and disappearing then into white society. And by the way, a lot of the early Africans didn't pass. They simply married white people. And after about 3 or 4 generations disappeared. Their families disappeared as being identifiable as African. And they became part of white society. And a lot of people are discovering all of that. Some of them knew that before, but they're discovering that through Ancestry or through any of these other databases. Most African Americans, however, most Native Americans are what I call summas. Some of this and some of that. And you see the same kinds of ethnicities. You see exactly what you mentioned. people from the Cameroons and from Angola and from the Congo and from Mali and Ghana and Benin, Togo, Nigeria, those places. And then you see Wales and Scotland and Ireland and England. And, you see the same things in this region. And it doesn't matter if you're from Virginia or North Carolina. And what that really tells us is our society is mixed. We just have been denying it. I remember about 20 years ago when we have a new category of biracial people because we've seen biracial people come about. Really? I think that started when the first European man walked on this continent. It's bizarre to me that we keep lying to ourselves. I like to show pictures of HBCUs at the turn of the 20th century or the latter part of the 19th century to my students, and they'll say, I didn't know these schools were integrated. They weren't. These are black people.
Yep.
Because people have been mixing. All of our main slave traders in Virginia had quote-unquote black wives. Every last one of them. Whether they had two families or one, they had black wives. And they took their children and educated their children. And after a few generations, those children disappeared as black people. And they became white. That's America, that America that we keep denying. And so this long history that we have of denial also plays a role in how people perceive whether you belong here or not. And when the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision of 1857 decided that black people did not belong in this country, were not contributors, were not citizens, were not even human beings, whether they were free or enslaved, our society shifted dramatically in a nasty, negative way. Because we started calling people either Americans or not Americans. And when we did that, we created a division that is hard. Now, people identifying as Asian American or African American, that's just about your identity and your sense of pride. Just like you have European Americans. And I make sure I don't do this same thing where everyone who's white is an American and everyone else is sort of a hyphen. I don't do that. I identify, if you identify as white, you're a European American. If you are Native, you're an indigenous person, or you're Native American or an Indian. It depends on who you are and how you define yourself. And if you're African American, some do not want to be called African Americans. They want to be called black. And so, yes, then I give people that opportunity to identify themselves and to claim their identity, because this is about claiming your identity. But it doesn't erase the fact that we have separated people as being either belonging and true Americans or not true Americans. And some of the rancor that you hear today in politics is just about that issue, because it's something nasty that really entered into American society in the 19th century.
So I want to ask a question of the three of you, because history is under attack in our schools.
It's always been under attack.
I know, but it continues to be under attack. Where there are people who want to ban books, they want things changed in terms of curriculum, etc. What can we as African Americans or Black people do to ensure that the next generation and the generations after that know about this history? And I'm going to start with you, Calvin.
That's a difficult question, because it goes back to who controls the educational system. When you tell our kids that your ancestors were not slaves, they were being taught a trade or a skill. This is not something new. We can go back to the early 2000s, and when Mike Huckabee was governor of Arkansas, he said slavery never existed. we were teaching your people a trade. So you got to go back and look at who controls the educational system. If we look at what goes on in Florida, and they want to ban all black books, and they want to ban the correct curriculum on our ancestors' history, then our children are not learning the history. They're learning someone else's version of history.
So, but Brian, to continue the conversation, is it then incumbent upon us as individuals to make sure that we find out the true history and then teach it to our children if we can't depend on the school system to do it?
Yeah, I think in the end, everything is an individual responsibility. Mm-hmm. I feel that way about myself and the sculpture. So one way of transmitting ideas into the future is to be as precise as humanly possible in the making of the artwork, like anything creative that's going to last a while. Mm-hmm. So as an artist, you're faced with this challenge where you're trying to create something with real gravity, but you can't go too far and make people want to jump off a cliff by looking at it. And you want to create something that's visually interesting and striking. Otherwise, why make it? It's not worth the time and treasure. But at the same time, you want to be creative, but you want to be reasonably accurate. So you strike a balance there. But it's all with the constant awareness that most of the people who will see this thing have yet to be born.
So when you're doing your sculpting and so forth, I mean, even just the history of what we've been talking about today, there's so many different nuances and questions of bondage and enslavement and on all of that. How do you decide what is going to be in that sculpture?
Well, the design it's up to me, but nobody has to pay for it. Mm-hmm. Like, I get commissioned to come up with artwork that is sufficient to convey everything about the design. And if they don't like it, then they can say, well, we really have a problem with this and that. And I can say, well, I think you're right, and change it. Or there's multiple ways in which we can interact. But the thing is that any commission, particularly one this large, is really an act of faith on the person who's got the money and is ruling the part with the money. They're just relying on everybody being sensible. And the nice thing about this project was I had a long enough period of time to wiggle through it, and I've forgotten how many changes I made. I must be on version 1,000 by now. I just ran out of time. Happily, I'm in a position where I actually like it myself, which is kind of rare. Mm-hmm. But that was an individual decision to keep hammering away. There's nobody telling you to do that. You lean into the work until the clock runs out and they say, what's up?
What's up? You got to get it done. Cassandra, back to the history. How do we keep it going? How do we get people, if we can't learn it in school, then what do we have to do?
Schools are supposed to be controlled by the populations. And schools our whole educational system is supposed to be a reflection of the standards in our society. And hopefully those standards are about truth-telling. But often they're not. Often they are politicized. And we focus more on what we want to be than who we really are. And if you are in a position where you lie about who you are, you'll never get to where you want to be because you're living in a false world. And so what I do is I try to encourage parents to be active. Stop sending your child to school and walking away. And expect the people in the educational system to be the professionals that they are. I don't walk into a doctor's office and start telling the doctor, who's a professional, how to diagnose whatever is there. But I am an advocate for myself. I do ask questions and I expect answers. And I think that a lot of parents, and they feel so inadequate, or they have so many other things they're doing that they invest too much they expect too much of the educational system. Too many teachers are spending too much time trying to parent a child rather than teach a child. And so if parents can be involved, but be involved in the things that you can control, and have high expectations. If your child is coming home and they don't have homework, you've got a problem. If your child is not really learning, you have a problem. And so I remind people that as educators, we're one person for a class of 30, minimally 30 students. You're a parent of how many? And so you can have and expect things. The other thing is, take your child to museums and libraries and historic sites and expose them and you to those things. Don't keep trying to entertain your child all the time. Learning can be entertaining. It can be exciting, and it can give young people a view of the world that they don't necessarily have.
Okay, Calvin.
Well, let me be quick. We didn't have this problem 50 years ago. The Republicans have come up with the name of being woke. We call it being educated. If you look at what's going on today's Ancestry and TV shows, who do you think you are? And going back and showing people that, 150 years ago, your ancestors owned slaves. They didn't want to hear that. That was their history. It was buried in their history. Now it's coming to the forefront, and some people are embarrassed to say, my great-great-granddaddy owned slaves. They don't want to hear it. They thought it was buried, and they want to bury it again. And if they keep it out of the educational system, it won't be taught.
Well, and that, ladies and gentlemen, ends the broadcast because we are just about out of time. Our guests, Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander, sculptor and artist Brian Owens, and Calvin Pearson, founder and president of Project 1619 Incorporated. Thank you so very, very much. And I want to ask our panel if you all will hang out, because our audience has a couple more questions that they'd like to ask you as we start to wrap things up. But we hope that you've enjoyed today's broadcast. In front of our live audience, give yourselves a big round of applause. And we hope that you will share the rich history you heard today with others. Go to anotherviewradio.org and you can download the podcast of this show or any of our Another View shows. We got a lot online. And be sure to sign up for our eView newsletter. It's a once-a-week reminder of upcoming shows. Next week on Another View, two of the youngest guests we have ever had on Another View, and they've written a book. So I'm not going to tell you who they are, but I need you to tune in and to check it out. Our theme music is an original composition created especially for Another View by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Jordan Christie and Victor Bowen are our audio engineers. And Dr. Barry Graham served as our studio producer. I'm Barbara Hamm Lee. We cannot know where we are going if we do not understand from whence we came. Think about it. And we'll get together again next Thursday at noon for Another View.